Thank you very much for inviting me. If you read the blurb, you will have seen I was last with you in 1986, which is a little bit longer than ideal, but I have very happy memories of coming to worship in August of that year in a group of people in a car who were singing army songs along the way to Meeting House. It was very interesting. Anyway. So what I'd like to do in the next 20 to 25 minutes is just talk a little bit about what we call the ideal of Quaker worship. How does it work at its best? How does it sit within the wider framework of the Quaker way? So first of all, I want to explain what I see as the four essential elements of the Quaker way, and then I will talk a bit more about worship. So for me, the fundamental element of Quakerism goes right back to that understanding of George Fox, that you could have a direct experience of the divine, a direct encounter with the divine. We find that in his journal, as he recalls what happens to him in 1647, when in a very low place, when his hopes in all men were gone and that he had nothing outwardly to help him. Then, oh then, I heard a voice which said, there is one, even Christ Jesus, that can speak to thy condition. And when he hears this, he's moved from a place of despair to a place of great joy and also understanding. He said, my heart did leap for joy, and I could see why there was none upon the earth that could speak to my condition, namely that I might give him all the glory. What we have in that extract is this sense of, as I say, direct encounter, but also in Fox's view, the idea that everyone could have that experience. So it wasn't that he was claiming any particular dispensation for himself, but rather that everybody could have this direct relationship with God. And that was very radical, because what that does is it puts us all as equal, gives us all equal spiritual authority within what we might call the Quaker Church. And that we are all ministers one to another, each with our different gifts and skills, but with nobody with any greater spiritual authority than anyone else. And from this, we get a really radical sense of equality that plays out through our 3.5 centuries of witness against titles and taking off of hats in deference and authority and these kinds of things. And a whole program, obviously, of social reform and a desire for peace and against the killing of anyone and against war. So just that idea that everyone can have this experience has radical and extreme consequences, which we try to live up to today. So that's the base element. That would be my first essential element of Quakerism, is this direct encounter with the divine, and that we can all participate in that. The second would be collective worship. Well, how are we going to nurture that sense of encounter? How are we going to try and make it more reliable, stronger, deeper? And the first friends talked about being gathered as in a net, that somehow this experience drew them together and bound them together. They weren't just transformed and kind of went back to the individual life of saying, well, I'm okay now. There was something about this experience which drew people to a collective kind of sensibility. And I'll then go into more about worship. But the third element then would be discernment. Because in a group that's led by the Spirit, we have to be really clear what is of God and what may be of our will or imagination. And so discernment becomes a really crucial and central aspect of the Quaker way. Without that, we could be going off in all kinds of directions and just doing our own thing, and the whole thing could easily fragment. And the fourth element will be the life of witness that comes out of this experience. So an experience of the Spirit does not leave us alone. It does not it does not leave us untouched or unchanged. And what we find typically is that we're then transformed spiritually in order to help transform wider society. And as a Quaker group, we could say we are open for transformation. If we placed ourselves along in the spiritual marketplace, we'd say, well, we're open for our spiritual business, we're open for transformation, both the personal transformation and our collective desire to transform an unjust society around us. So those are those four elements. And there, in our liberal tradition, we're quite low on detailed theology, but we are high on the need to do things together. They all work better when we're doing them together, whether it's worship, discernment, or witness. But we do have some theology. We have a theology that actually something can happen in our silence and stillness that we place great store by. We're not just a secular society that enjoys a bit of quiet at the end of a busy week. We actually believe that something really quite crucial and wonderfully unpredictable can happen in our morning worship. So in some sense, worship is, you could say, it's an additional, it's not, it's a kind of it's to help us do what we're about to do in our life of the Spirit, in our lives of faith, but also it's central to what we do as a faith community. It's the reason we come together, not to talk about NPR or not even to help with the refugee work. We come ostensibly and centrally and fundamentally to worship together. Everything else comes out of that. All of our fellowship, all of our witness work, all ideally that we're led to do during the week. So in that sense, it's central to our organizational life. And indeed, we have kept it largely unchanged over 3.5 centuries. Our theological understanding of it has changed quite a lot. If we go back to the first friends, we're likely to think of it in terms of a kind of an inward experience of the second coming of Christ, and a whole kind of theology around silence as outlined in the book of Revelation, and an inward communion as talked about in Revelation 3:20, those who hear me knock, I will come and sup inwardly. And we could still think of our Quaker worship as a form of collective inward communion. But largely we don't use that kind of language today. But although our theological understandings of what's going on have changed, we've actually kept silence and stillness as our core form of worship, where obviously the majority of the Quaker world has now adopted other ways with pastors and programming and some music to help people prepare for that moment of communion. We feel we can do it with silence and stillness alone, and without the need to separate any group of people to help us get to that place. So in some ways, Quaker worship is set up on rather grand claims that we can just come along from our everyday life and sink into this place of communion, our own inward Eucharist, as it were. But I would say we've kept it for 3.5 centuries because it has kept working for us. That for those, obviously those of us who come, we find it vital and important and crucial, and it works. It may not work every time, but it works enough for us to believe that this is the place we want and need to be spiritually. So now we have made it shorter by about half an hour a century. So typically in the 17th century, worship was 3 hours. There's stories of a 9-hour worship. But 3 hours, maybe George Fox would minister for an hour, apparently. But, so we've got less silence, but less ministry. But and we may need to keep an eye on that. We don't necessarily want to make it any shorter than an hour, I think. And you will find some meetings now experimenting with longer periods of worship, either untimed, trying to discern when to close worship, or as in my meeting, we occasionally have a 3-hour meeting or a 2-hour meeting. not at the regular time, but by particular arrangement. I think the reduction in the time of worship means that we need to come particularly with heart and mind prepared. And when talking with friends, you'll find that people have various strategies to try and arrive at the meeting house in the right frame of mind, the right frame of heart. It may be that we don't listen to the radio that morning, or we listen to music rather than talk radio, or we try and walk if we can to meeting instead of using public or private transport. That we don't read the newspaper, or that we do read some poetry, or whatever it is, just something that's going to help us be in the right frame of heart for meeting. And once we're within the meeting house, we may also have other strategies to help us sink into the silence. So somebody I heard once likened meeting for worship as akin to one of those multi-layered jars of pickled vegetables, with maybe the carrots and then the gherkins and then and in a way, as we sink into the silence, I'd suggest we're going through those different layers of lack of noise, those different layers of absence. It might be initially we can still hear people chatting in whispers, or wondering whether the heating's on, or if the clock's wound up, or whatever it is, or how their leg is, or whatever. But gradually, as the more and more of us gather in the meeting room, the silence moves from just an absence of noise into something far deeper. And we will descend through those layers of silence, ideally. Ideally, I suggest we will be setting self aside, that we will be trying to take ourselves out of our heads, out of our everyday concerns, out of our own imaginations and will and desire, into this other place, ideally into some kind of mystical connection with spirit or the divine, or however you most like to describe it. And that's no easy thing. And we are not necessarily very good at helping people practice this. We don't, kind of have classes on what to do in meeting for worship, or training for silence, or those sorts of things. What we do know, though, is some heartfelt reality that silence is our approach to the divine. It's also the place in which we hope to hear the divine and discern the divine. And in Britain, and it may be true with you as well, we have a little postcard that says, "I am a Quaker. In case of emergency, please be silent." Because where are we going to go if in the place of a crisis? Well, obviously we're going to turn to help beyond ourselves, beyond the material. And for us as Quakers in our tradition, it means about sinking into silence and stillness. And there are various apocryphal stories about people faced with extreme danger or threat, but falling into silence and stillness and disarming those who were posing a threat. Just that very absence of outward response is very unsettling. It's countercultural in its extreme. But we know that absence leads to a sense of presence, that something happens in that active, dynamic engagement that we find in our silent worship. It is, in its best sense, an inward communion, a communion both between us and spirit and amongst ourselves as a gathered community. And within that, we may or may not have ministry, but silence and stillness in and of itself is sufficient. We have built a whole church, as it were, on that basis, on the sufficiency of this form of worship, on the sufficiency of what this form of worship gives us in terms of our connection with spirit. It's a very unusual situation. There's many other mystical, a whole tradition of mystics, and but generally those other mystics, say in the Catholic tradition, have continued to go along to Mass. What we've said is, no, this is enough. We will be gathered together, practical mystics, collectively mystic, and all we need is to try and find the means to that connection. And we know that can happen at any time, at any place. It happens to Fox on his own. It happens to Margaret Fell in the pew. Happens to James Naylor at the plough. Happened to me on a Greyhound bus outside St. Louis. So, you know, and so we needn't come to worship at all at one level, because God may break into our lives in any place at any time. And once that happens, we may find ourselves in a transformed space that knows no boundaries between time and place. No day is any more special than any other, and no place is any more special than any other. It's a fantastically idealistic tradition in that sense. Sorry, I just forgot to plug in to pick up Paddy. Okay. There we go, sorry. But coming to worship, as I suggested earlier, increases the reliability of that sense of connection, increases, I suggest, the possibility of that sense of connection. That even if I'm not feeling it on any particular Sunday or Wednesday or Tuesday when we meet, I will get a glimpse of that possibility of communion through other people's worship and through the vocal ministry. That together we are ministers one to another, gathering together, helping each other along the way. And there's an advice in the British discipline about coming to worship even when you don't want to. A, we never know what effect it may have on somebody else. And B, we may indeed very much need to be there at the time when we don't want to. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about vocal ministry just in the last few minutes of this. It's not necessary, but it can add to our worship. And that really would be one of the tests. You can see flow charts of discernment processes. You can find them around the Quaker world about what to do if you think you might have ministry. So is this from God? Yes, no. Is this from God for this meeting? Yes, no. Is this from God for this meeting for today? Yes, no. Is this from God for this meeting for today for me to share? And it may be, as we're going through that process, somebody else stands up and offers a very similar sentiment. And ideally, we'll check all those things, or we will find ourselves on our feet without any conscious thought. We will be pushed by the Holy Spirit up and maybe not even know what it was that we said afterwards. It may be a highly discomforting experience as the ministry comes through us. And one of the things we're in the habit of saying these days is thanking people for their ministry, which is good because it encourages people to be open and hopefully faithful to what they're given and not shy away from it. But I remember going to a meeting in the conservative tradition, and there they said, thank you for being faithful to the words you were given. And one of the things we may need to remember is, of course, that ministry is coming through us for the community. Our job is to be open to the Spirit. And that may result in vocal ministry, or it may just result in us holding the silence, having a ministry of silence. I've probably said enough for now. We will have some time for comments, reflections, and questions. But I would say what I've tried to do is paint a kind of an ideal of what meeting for worship might be like. And I know it's not always that easy, and I know it doesn't always happen that way. But it is ideal in another way as well. For those of us within the Quaker tradition, we do feel this is the ideal form of Quaker worship. And whilst we may be very broad in terms of our beliefs, we do have a great unity in terms of the way that we want to worship and feel the need to worship and value what we know works so well. So I'll leave it there, and but please do respond with questions or comments, or however you normally run your forum time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll try to keep an eye if people have their hands up, and there are quite a few people online. I can't see what's happening in the meeting house, obviously, so just go ahead. If you're going to ask a question from the meeting house, just make sure to direct it into that microphone in the meeting house. I'll take a lead with one, Ben. I wondered whether you ever see meetings experimenting with meetings in which the expectation is that there will only be silence. So, for example, I think this is an interesting thing, having sort of experimented with collective worship in the Buddhist tradition. I mean, a big difference is that there are no messages. You know, there's a commitment to there being no messages. And so I just wondered about that, whether that's something that people are ever experiment with.
Thank you, David. So many meetings in Britain are now really rather small. Generally, we would love ministry, maybe even a little bit more. And so I haven't seen that as an explicit experiment. And I think theologically, it could be a little bit difficult to say, well, if you're given something, we don't want to hear it. But it's interesting. I've seen meetings advertised like that internationally. What we've done the other way is often offered a reading at the beginning of meeting to help people make that transition into this space of worship. So maybe a reading from the Book of Discipline or something else. It just helps us realize where we are and what we're about. It's not always easy. We might come in, we might say hello to somebody, we may just sit down, and we have to make that transition personally. And you know, many a time I've just sat in meeting just with the whole of work or whatever else whirring around, and I haven't really got into a space of worship. A reading may help us move into that. It may frame, you know, may start off a chain of ministry as well. So that's one thing. We've also experimented in my meeting with themed work, semi-programmed, initially as all age to help keep us all together rather than asking young people to leave or to come back in later. And that has worked very well, even though we now have no children. 4 times a year, we have themed worship. So, yes.
Bob, go ahead, please.
Oh, let me unmute. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. This is a question that Rose and I have discussed a number of times, and it's so fundamental. Is music, and is there any time when it's appropriate to sing?
Okay. Well, I mean, I should probably say in relation to the other question as well that we can do what we like with our liturgical form. And in fact, historically, we've made it shorter in the unprogrammed tradition, and we have a whole big, you know, 90% of the Quaker world are now programmed with plenty of music. So, you know, we could make worship longer, shorter, add in elements. One meeting I knew used to have half an hour of singing before the silence. But I have also heard, of course, sung ministry. And occasionally people might join in with that. I mean, the initial critique of programming and of music was that everyone was doing it together at the same time. And you know, our critique of historically of programming is that it's holding humanity back from being open to this direct relationship. You know, the more we fill the space with other things, the less time we have for that sense of communion, that sense of direct connection. But, you know, nothing wrong with music at all. And I mean, I've seen a 5-piece electric band in Indiana, and I've had, you know, there's robed choirs in North Carolina, and, you know, anything is possible. I mean, we may or may not want it, but it's, you know, it's up for us to discern what will work best to nurture this sense of encounter.
Steve and then Bonalyn.
Okay, and I think we also have a question here in the meeting house.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Ben. Great session. I really, really enjoyed everything you had to share. So I'm the clerk of the outreach committee, and part of the outreach role is to try to build membership. One of the things that I see as a concern is there's so many things competing for that Sunday morning time now. And you really emphasize the importance of finding time to come together in community. Are you seeing anything that is welcoming younger families, younger friends in that have this struggle with competing time and allows them to come together somehow in community when Sunday mornings doesn't work?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So we ran a really interesting exercise in my monthly meeting where we split into, I think, 4 groups, and we said, right, you're trying to keep people away from meeting. Okay, you've got the group of families and young children. You can have people on lower incomes. You can have first-time inquirers, and yeah, and there was maybe some another group as well. Maybe I think, you know, younger friends. And what was interesting is that we really got into this as an exercise. We were really creative and excited about how we would keep people out. I mean, as a kind of a little experiment, we got really energized by it. And we came up with lots of things and we shared them. And unfortunately, it seemed that we were doing most of them already. So we were, you know, we were only meeting on a Sunday morning, which we knew was difficult for families with younger children. We were not advertising ourselves very well or very widely. So, you know, if you wanted to keep inquirers out, you just don't tell people where you're meeting. And then when they get through the door, you talk in code, like initials like AFSC and, you know, PYM, and have you been to, you know, these sorts of things. And you know, and then we would have shared meals in restaurants where, you know, which were maybe beyond the means of some people, and so we'd exclude them in that way. What was great is that one meeting immediately decided to have a Wednesday evening meeting, and we certainly got younger people then. The timing is tricky if you've got children, but again, no day is any more special than any other. We've ended up on Sundays probably because it was the, you know, the day that people weren't working as much. But you know, one meeting I know is now moved to Saturday because the public transport is so much better. So, you know, we can do what we like, and we may need to be creative, and we may need to experiment, and we may need to get it wrong a few times, and then we'll get it right. And hopefully more people will come if we can give a positive message about what we're offering as well, not just a list of what the things we don't do, but just all the great things that we're about. So yeah, thanks, Steve.
Great, thank you.
Donna Lynn, did you want to? And then there is in the meeting house, we'll pick up some questions from the meeting house.
Yeah, great. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Daniel, my name is Donna Lynn. I just wanted to thank you for this such a succinct summary of the really roots of Quakerism. It was such a great summary. Thank you. I wanted to refer to the point you made about we have these decision charts that we use sometimes about deciding whether a message is to be presented or not. And one of the questions on all the charts, as you said, is this a message from God? And I've long considered this. And it seems to me personally, for example, if I'm standing to deliver a message about something I'm personally worried about, or I think the world should be worried about, it always seems to me that's not something God would be saying through me. So I'm wondering if you have any guidance to offer on that query of, is this a message from God?
Thank you, Bonalyn. So first of all, I should say, when I say God, I again hope you can translate into your preferred spiritual language.
Sure.
But I don't see why God wouldn't want to share something that you were concerned about, because I mean, that might be something we all need to hear. I mean, one of the things looking back over Quaker history is that we've tended to sometimes prioritize our own comfort over the things that we should be doing. And we can look back at people like Benjamin Lay and John Woolman, and in Britain, Elizabeth Fry, and find that we love them now. But at the time, they were really awkward kinds of people that we, wanted to kind of marginalize slightly, or, hush, or, I mean, Elizabeth Fry got told off because her daughters married non-Quakers, and she obviously was spending too much time in that prison and not enough time being a good mother. So we may need to listen to the people who are discomforting us at the moment. And I mean, if you have a concern laid on your heart, then the place to share it is in meeting, because as well as those aspects of deepening worship and strengthening it, part of being a minister one to another is testing our leadings. Is this really something that is, that's important? And is it maybe important not just for me, but for everyone? So, I mean, if you came with a pre-prepared political message and, knew you were going to deliver it at 10-2 or something, then I'd say, well, maybe hesitate on that. That's not, it's not going to tick the boxes. But if you find yourself on your feet and it's talking about something personal, then that is from the heart, and absolutely. And why is it not God speaking through you? So.
Thank you.
Hey, in the meeting house, I know we have a couple, and then I think Biddy has got her hand up. So let's go into the meeting house.
Do you have any ideas about how to deepen worship in the Zoom hybrid era? Okay, if I heard that correctly, is it about how we deepen worship in the Zoom hybrid era? Yeah. Okay. This is all very new, and it's obviously challenging. People have very different views about the technology. So I know of one meeting in Britain that now has a Zoom only meeting, a hybrid meeting, and also a in-person only meeting, because the meeting is actually divided over the value of the technology or the value of the hybrid. So I'm glad you're experimenting, and I'm hoping it's working well for you. In my meeting, the secret to helping deepen the Zoom worship was to have plenty of fellowship time, and to use the breakout rooms to be in 2s and 3s after worship, maybe for 10 minutes, and then we'd swap round and have another 2 or 3 and another 2 or 3. Now we have a hybrid meeting. We may have a small conversation around the screen, but we'll also encourage other people to get into other conversations in other parts of the meeting house, just so it's more like it was before we had Zoom. But the secret to, I think, any form of deepening worship is to know each other well, and to get to know each other, and to share our daily and weekly concerns, what's going on for us, and the more we know each other, the more we can share, and the deeper the worship will get. So I'd say plenty of fellowship time, and just adjust the technology so you can manage it online. I wouldn't suggest that everyone in the meeting house then has to sit around the screen and talk to 15, 20 people. But yeah, experiment with that as well and see what works for you.
I'm looking, I guess, Biddy, do you want to go?
Yeah, so this is to follow up on Bonalyn's question. And so can you speak to how one can help members know what is of God and what is of them? Because sometimes it will seem like there's a lot of what is of them that comes out, right? Mm-hmm. And so how do we help our meeting pay attention to that?
Okay.
And both as an individual level and as a group.
Okay, that's a great question. So first thing I'd say is, of course, we don't know always what is, truly ministry and what isn't. And I once heard someone give an advertisement for a film they'd produced, and they stood up and said, "Oh, my film on bereavement will be available on Saturday. You can give me $9.95 at the end of meeting if you want to buy a copy." And I'm sitting there very indignant, very self-righteous. This is surely is not ministry. It's out, heavens, we're not teaching the Quaker way well enough here. But the word bereavement then set off an amazing chain of deep and powerful ministry that really gathered the meeting together. And I reflected at the end, well, who am I to judge what, I mean, it's a very difficult thing,
Right.
if anyone has the role of interrupting a ministry that's too long or unhelpful, it's a very difficult bit of discernment. But what if it is from God? Who am I to do this? Well, we're needing to discern all the time. But one of the things that struck me as well is I went to First Friends in Seattle, which is a mainly program meeting, but with at least half an hour of open worship. And so they had a pastor, and they went through various things. But as they got to the open worship, the pastor then introduced the open worship and said, right, we're now going into a period of silence and stillness. This is what we think can happen. Everyone is welcome to minister. Ministry in our tradition is typically like this. You're encouraged to, maybe speak briefly or from the heart. And what struck me was that they expected there to be people there who'd never been before. And in my meeting, we never really expect that. Or if the newcomer comes through the door, we might give them a leaflet and say, oh, have you been before? Okay, well, here's a leaflet called Your First Time in Quaker Meeting. And they then read their way into a Quaker life. And it's not a very easy read either. It's full of qualifiers and caveats. And when we say this, of course, we don't, And I sometimes I think, well, maybe we need to introduce worship a bit more frequently so that it not only tells the newcomer what's going on, but reminds us what we're about. What are we expecting to happen in the next hour? Why are we there? So the other thing I think I just bring this in is I was speaking with someone from Alcoholics Anonymous the other day, and we were comparing our meetings, and they were saying, well, we don't own any property, we don't have a bank account, we don't want those things that really make life complicated and where all of our energies go into running the building, which someone on premises is a familiar story. But they also said, of course, also we all know we have to be at that meeting. Like, it's really crucial to us that we're at our meetings. And I think we have a very broad theological spectrum, and sometimes people say, oh, well, we're divided theologically. But there may also be a dividing line between those of us who really need to be at worship, for who it's absolutely crucial, and for those for whom it's kind of pleasant but not crucial. And we don't want to start naming people or drawing people, but we have to remember that worship is a public meeting. And we have someone who's come along faithfully for 15 years. I have no desire to get involved in Quakerism in any way beyond the worship. They've never read the Book of Discipline. And we have to remember we are also a public space where anything may happen. In some ways, it's amazing that it isn't kind of more disrupted than it is. And so sometimes we will have ministry that may not feel like it, but it may speak to somebody, or it may help the speaker. And then we'll be here next week, so we can hopefully, run along with that. But also we need to teach the Quaker way. For those of us who are committed, we need to know what it is we're joining and what we're part of and why we do things the way we do. So I'd say education is really crucial as well. Thanks. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
And that was wonderful. Just two things. I love the idea of sinking into silence. It's a beautiful metaphor. And the last is, you spoke about discernment and transformation as these 4 parts of worship. Can you speak a little bit more about transformation, like what it is that you experience?
Okay, well, I would say in my Quaker life, I've been taken to a new place. I came into Quakerism as a very confrontational ex-anarchist, with this weird name and pink hair at the time, and ardent vegan. And, I think I've learned a lot about trying to be more alongside people, but also my political action, my transforming work, as far as I'm able to achieve it, is done out of a place of spirituality rather than ideology. So I'm trying to lead a life that is led, ideally, and I will get that wrong and mess up, and but that's a big difference for me. So when I'm talking about we're open for transformation, we're trying to achieve world peace and climate justice and all of these things, but out of a spiritual understanding. So anything that might count as testimony, I would say that's our work, it's our transformation axis. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I have Rose, and then I know we have another one from inside the meeting house.
Well, Ben, thank you again. It was very inspiring. And I just had a couple questions that have to do with messaging. And that I think we are always in conflict between believing that there's that of God in everyone and that the messages come from that place versus sitting in judgment of that's not really a message. That's a personal gripe. That's a personal indulgence. And when you have a group of people who all of them bring their own personalities to the meeting, and some being more dominant than others, and you find that, you can almost predict who will have a message and who won't. The question I have is, how do you refrain from sitting in judgment over the messages that come through? How do you not have an orthodoxy of what's acceptable and what's not?
Yeah, lovely, thank you. I mean, we do have guidelines, which is interesting. So again, theologically, we'd have no restraint on anything. There's no reason why someone shouldn't minister more than once in the hour, that they should, or that they might not minister for the whole hour. But we tend to have guidelines, to speak briefly, to speak only once.
Sure.
And I think that's to safeguard the dangers of the freedom of our form of worship. So, I understand that now, but equally some people, I mean, as mentioned before, we all have different gifts, and some people will have a gift of vocal ministry. So it may be one person's gift to speak more regularly than others, and for someone else never maybe to minister vocally because their ministry is expressed in other ways. It might be making sure we've got cookies or, tea and coffee and these kinds of things. And or doing the tech or whatever it is. So we will have different gifts. I think, how do we stop judging? I mean, for me, I've just because, that one story of realizing I had judged wrongly will help me not sit in judgment. But ideally, in that place of worship, we will have set self aside or be aspiring to. And for me, that means trying to leave behind all that head stuff, including the judgment. If I really am able to sink into the silence, that ministry will either speak to me or wash over me. And, will help all of us gather into an even deeper place. But it would have to be fairly extreme for it to really disrupt the whole of our worship. And it's at that point that we, in Britain, an elder would then interrupt and say, friend, you've given us much to think about. Maybe we can consider this silence, or even walk them out of the room and say, can we this is really interesting, but we need to let the rest of the group fall back into silence. But it has to be really pretty extreme for that to happen. And in Britain, that would tend to be on length. If someone was going on too long, we would probably want to stop it. But someone could say something absolutely outrageous and unhelpful and disruptive in 2 minutes.
Right.
Something really appalling that, but again, we just need to take it into the worship, because where better a place to take it than into that sense of connection. And but it isn't easy, but we
From in the meeting house, I know we have maybe more than one, so please speak up, because it's hard for me to see who's in the meeting house.
Ben, can you characterize your experience of a gathered meeting, and more particularly, perhaps your experience of a gathered meeting where no vocal ministry is offered?
Okay. So coming as an outsider, I can see you're keen on this lack of vocal ministry. So, so a gathered meeting for me is one where not only I feel I've been taken to a very deep place, but it's clear that we all have. And I think I've experienced it most in meetings for business. But there have been, really just beautiful meetings with maybe a little bit of ministry or just that spoke or wholly silent. I think the time might feel like it's gone more quickly, and that suddenly the meeting is closing and we don't necessarily even want it to close. And one of the things we've also said in my meeting is that we will start on time, but we won't necessarily finish on time. And, obviously if someone ministers right close to the end of the hour, we'll carry on a bit. But also if we're in a very deep or covered or gathered space, we may want to just carry on a little bit longer. Interestingly, I've found there's been less ministry in longer meetings. So the 2-hour and the 3-hour meetings that we've had have often been totally silent. It may be there's a sense of kind of an expanded sense of time. People just, are not watching the clocks. They're not then, really do set self aside more easily and more thoroughly. And it may be then there isn't ministry, or, the usual suspects aren't moved to speak in the usual way. But it is a challenge, and as I said, theologically, it's difficult to constrain something laid on somebody's heart by the Spirit. So, but we may need to keep talking about it or introduce what's going on and help people go through that flow chart more thoroughly. If there is too much ministry that doesn't feel like ministry.
Anything else from inside the meeting house? Okay. Anybody else have anything? Anybody online on Zoom? I don't see any. So looks like that's it. I don't know. Is Dave Watt still in the meeting house?
I am.
Okay, great. Okay, great. I didn't
And
know.
I do want to assure Ben that we're not a very secular country. And so here at Radnor meeting, our meetings for worship are always 3 hours. Sometimes they're more than that, but 3 is the absolute minimum here.
And 3 times in a day.
That's great. Well, I know everyone will want to thank you, Ben. This was really awesome, and I have recorded it, and so we'll make it available for people that couldn't be here, and we're holding you in the light. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been really wonderful to be with you all, and I hope I'll be with you face to face at some point. It'd be lovely.
Cool.
Okay, take care. God bless. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dave,
Yeah.
I sign up. Will there be a follow-up discussion of this, or a time maybe where a few of us could get together and talk?
Yeah. So you're saying that you would like to see us schedule a opportunity for people to maybe have some discussion about this meeting?
I would appreciate it very much if there are others who would feel similarly.
That's great. That is great. I will make sure that we get that to work. I think this was organized by Worship and Ministry, so I'm going to circle back to Worship and Ministry and ask for their help in putting together another opportunity to talk about it.
And thank you again for all your tech help. Greatly appreciate it.
That's good.
Have a good week.
Yep. Love you. Take care.
I'd like to second Harriet's suggestion. I think it would be wonderful to have a follow-up.
Great.
Because it takes time to really process all of what was presented. And it's a wonderful, wonderful forum. Oh, just fabulous.
Awesome. We will make that happen.
Thank you.
Okay, I see some people they turned off the meeting house link, so I think we are pretty much wrapping up. I'm going to stop the recording and